cash crunch on and when payroll has to go, although it's great to be able to pay people at great new jobs.
Yeah.
But it has been really tough trying to sustain and thrive in an environment like this, in a time like this, in a country that was going through so much. But we've learned quite a lot of stuff along the way.
Right. Yeah. It seems like you've got the trifecta there, right? Obviously, starting any startup is a massively turbulent process in and of itself, and that presents its own challenges. Like you mentioned, media and publishing is going through a complete upheaval. That's another massive challenge in and of itself. And yeah, South Africa as well, like you mentioned, is going through some turbulent times there too. So you're really facing the coalface at every angle.
Yeah, it often feels like that Netflix documentary of that mountain Kwana who did the 14 peaks, and it felt like that was a jump. Once you finish one, you got the next highest peak in the world, like just waiting for you around the corner. And so
the analogy of every time you get to the peak of the hill, you just see the next peak then. And that's, but I guess that's probably what keeps you going, right? I mean, it sounds like you've grown from, what was it, 4 or 5 people you mentioned to now over 100. I mean, that's some seriously impressive transformation and progression. And, because that sounds like you're not just surviving, but you're thriving.
Yeah, we like to call it thriving because it always feels like it's you're in the midst of an existential crisis. But within that, what are we doing to think about innovation? How are we trying to, bring new products to market? How are we trying to improve the quality of the journalism that we're doing so that it's more in touch with the needs of society? How are we being more strategic in our work, in our planning, in our resource allocation? What kind of culture do we want to have? And so all of that is important to do, and you can't just be, caught in a doom spiral of negativity and and downsizing and neglect and all those things that go with it. So it's like the Buddhists say, life is suffering, and the minute you understand it and accept that, then it becomes, less hard and less of a suffering. And so I think, we just sort of acknowledge that that's the world that we work in. That's where we are, but the value to society is huge, and it's important that we keep doing this work. And so we can show a purpose, and that fuels a lot of our effort and our energy. And we understand that all these things are important to long-term sustainability. And so we like to think we're an innovative organization. We could obviously do a lot better and a lot more. But it's important. It's an important part of our culture, and it's something that we support and encourage people to do. And we're always trying to improve on those things, on strategy, culture, innovation, and all in pursuit of improving the quality of the work and the impact that our work has in the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, thanks a million for sharing. And you mentioned trying to avoid the doom news loop. I personally hate it. I know a lot of people hate it, obviously, and there's a big trend of news avoidance. So I guess, how do you, because Daily Maverick is a daily publication, right? So how do you keep things fresh from that perspective without, falling into that doom loop, so to speak?
Yeah, we did some work in the last couple of years to really ask these questions of ourselves. It took us 12 years before we first asked, what is journalism for? You think it'd be a fundamental question that any organization should be able to answer like that, right? And so, but it took us 12 years to interrogate it, to debate it, and to speculate on a definition of what journalism is for, that we believe for the type of journalism that we want to pursue. And then, how does our vision and mission build on top of that? And then how does that translate into the needs of society, and looking at what are the clues that we can get where we are at the moment? What's the most important thing? What does the world worry about? What does the company spend its money on? What do people spend their money on? What are their hopes and dreams? What are their biggest fears? And so going through those foundational and fundamental things has helped us, and working through those has helped us develop a framework and to come up with some of the answers that we feel help us connect those dots and in a way that is aligned with the kind of work that we want to do and the needs that society has. And so when that stuff sort of starts working together, when it starts complementing each other, when all of that is aligned, then you start producing work which is more valuable because it starts serving the needs of the people in this country. And then when it does that, it starts creating value, and then they reward you with their time or their email address and potentially even their budget. And so we've seen that, a great improvement in our reach, in people signing up to become newsletter subscribers and supporting us with their voluntary contributions in the last 3 years since we spent the time to really work on this stuff.
Yeah.
And in that time, this phenomenon of news avoidance, news fatigue, has been rising, and we've seen our peers flatline or kind of go backwards a little bit in terms of their reach when we were seeing 2, 3, 4x, of our key metrics. And so that really solidified what we were seeing and affirmed that, that investing in the strategic stuff, asking these tough questions, debating and deliberating is worth it, because you end up being of greater service to society. And that's what we keep trying to reinforce, that journalism is not a commodity, it shouldn't be a commodity. It should be a service. And if we think of it as a service, then who are we servicing? What do they value? How do we create that value? How is it aligned, that overlap, that Venn diagram of our vision and needs? And so all these things are really important. It certainly helped us in the last couple of years to become better at what we do and to be able to grow our business through that.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a nutshell, if you're to sum that up, it's about the needs of people. Journalism, as you define it, is about the needs of people, and that's fed by the values that they hold. And so then that's basically where the starting point is then.
We want to do a particular kind of journalism. We have a vision for the kind of journalism that we want to do. And so it's important to both understand the needs of society, but where does that overlap with the vision that we have? And in that intersection is where the magic happens. And that's what we want to do more of, right? And so if we started out as an entertainment website, or if we had some other kind of vision, then we would end up in a different place. So it's important that the two work together, right? And so there's a direction and a vision on the one side, but it has to overlap with the needs. If there's no overlap with the needs, then you're just not going to get any traction. You're not going to get any way towards sustainability. And then, asking yourself, well, why do you even exist?
One of the things that I've noticed just on a personal level is that there is sort of a blurring of lines between, say, you mentioned entertainment there, but I think it's also beyond that. I mean, you've got journalism maybe on one side, but you've got advocacy then, you've got marketing, you've got entertainment, and then probably at the worst end of the scale, you've got propaganda, which also exists as well. And maybe the difficulty for the layperson or for somebody who's not deep into the media sphere, it might be difficult to distinguish the differences between, say, journalism and advocacy or entertainment. So how do you guys at Daily Maverick, first of all, approach that problem? And then I guess, how do you avoid, because, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But some of journalism, I guess, does have to have some level of entertainment value to it to keep people somewhat engaged, because dry facts and data kind of bore people, right? So where's the line?
Yeah, certainly you do need to be able to package it in a way that makes it easier to consume. And depending on which platform you're on, what your preferences are, is that in text? Is that in video? Is it in audio? Is it in print? Is it on a mobile screen? And so, but the underlying work, it needs to be done. And then it's a case of repackaging it and then putting it in different places so that it can have the biggest potential impact. And sometimes that impact is linked to reach. And so that's how we think about it is, if we know that it addresses a need, then that work's done. But then the next case is, okay, well, now how do we amplify the impact of this work that we've chosen to invest our limited resources in? And how do we give the best chance of success? Bearing in mind at the same time, there's all those things you mentioned that we are moving away from information integrity, especially in the social media space. There are no controls. There are no guardrails to assist people in knowing what is, and it's reliant on the individual to kind of try and figure out, what is legitimate, what is propaganda, what is mis and disinformation, all these things. Who are the bad actors? Who can you trust? Who can't you trust? Who can you trust some of the time? Who's trying to weaponize that relationship with, 2% propaganda campaign? And all of these are really complicated things. And so we see that as part of our job is to do that underlying foundational work, publish that on our site in different formats, and then how can you take that and then put that out into the world that also helps combat some of that stuff, so that when people see the Daily Maverick brand attached to a piece of journalism, that our history, our track record, and our values and our vision and mission are all, a marker of something that you can trust. And that's what we strive for. But we're doing that in a time where journalism is now a very, very small part of this big information space. Someone called it one flavor in a information ice cream shop. But I think that that isn't the best analogy, because it assumes all those flavors are kind of equal in some way. They have the same nutritional value, and that you'll have a pleasant experience from each of those. It's just a personal taste. But if it was more accurate, there would be streams that fit in that ice cream shop, if we were being honest. Yeah. Right? And so I don't think that analogy works. But we're a smaller part of much bigger information system with more restrictions on us and the way that we work, because we have to go through a professional process, which incurs costs and time delays and an editorial process. And so it's not a level playing field. At the same time, and then on top of that, you have this phenomenon of where a lot of the people who do that professional work are putting all their work behind a paywall, and all the crap can fly around the world in no matter, in a matter of seconds. And you have these two things where it takes longer to do a professional job, get that out there, and then put it behind a paywall. So, there's something very wrong with how we've allowed the information system to develop and erode information integrity. And we can see the impact of that around the world. We can see how populists have hijacked the discontent that exists in the world, which is legitimate, but through these circumstances that have now materialized. And so it's a very tough job that we're trying to do with limited resources, more restrictions.
You've nailed it, really, as far as I can see, with the two words you mentioned there, trust and accountability, right? So it's being able to show people that you're putting your best foot forward and that they can have faith in the reporting that you're doing. But also then, humans are humans, we're going to make mistakes. And if you do make a mistake, to kind of just be accountable for it. But like you say, that seems to be happening less and less. And with all that, let's call it the premium content or the quality, so to speak, behind a paywall, and all the shit let fly for free, it becomes quite a challenge to even approach the problem from a practical point of view, because for example, writer's block, what we do is we try and push for people to paywall some of that content, because we believe that the business of a publication should be driven by the readers, because they're the most engaged with the publication, rather than, say, relying on things like grants or government funding or charitable donations or whatever that might be, or ads even, right? So, but that feels like it might be a whack-a-mole game, right? So every time you solve one problem, maybe one or two other different problems appear somewhere else. So maybe it's a question of trade-offs.
Look, I think there's a particular strand or segment of journalism which qualifies as public interest journalism. And that's the work that we do. Reporting on institutions, investigations, all those things that help strengthen democracy, for example, a really important part of that. And that kind of journalism, in my mind, is a public good, and it should be supported as a public good. And there's also a whole lot of other journalistic endeavors around that, for example. And so, you could be a business publication, for example, which, operates as a private good, and a paywalled operation is great. But we need public interest journalism to be freely accessible to as many people as possible, and supported and funded as a public good. And I think that's the problem that we're not defining right now as an industry. And we don't have the policy frameworks, we don't have the incentives, we don't have the frameworks and structures to support it like that. And we're losing ground because of that, as the industry has sort of gone from highly profitable, oligopolistic, protected industry from 20 years ago to where we are now is disrupted, and a fraction of where we are in terms of the people, in terms of the resources that we had, are trying to now compete with the best resourced companies in the world when the market has shifted and the economics no longer work, and the market failure has taken place and exists in this space. So I fully acknowledge and accept that paywalls are a part of the world, but I don't think that it's good for society if public interest journalism as a subset of that is paywalled. I think we see the impact of that then being limited to the people who can pay, and then that means that all this other stuff is freely available without any checks and balances. And that's why we are seeing the problems that we're seeing today in every country on earth.
The question, I guess, that naturally follows that, and there's, because there's different perspectives on it, of course. And I remember, because we met in Berlin a couple of weeks back, and our friend Paul Gerbino, who would, let's say, have a different perspective on government intervention in things, especially because, he's from the States, and there's more of a sensitivity, I guess, to that. So what would your thoughts be around, because I've spoken to a few people about this, actually. And one of the interesting things somebody said to me recently, Marcella Kunova, actually, of journalism.co.uk, she said that if you look at somewhere like the UK, public goods are treated really badly. Like, look at the NHS, that receives a lot of funding and it's treated terribly. So what are your thoughts around, say, if government gets involved with things like media and journalism, that it doesn't devolve into just essentially propaganda?
I have heard that response, but what people forget or haven't dived deep enough into the options that you have available to you when you design a public support mechanism for journalism. In the case of the NHS, and in the case of public service media, for example, there are all these direct subsidies that have been set up, and these direct funding mechanisms. And with any direct subsidy, there's a reliance and a dependency that can be, it doesn't guarantee that it is, but that can create all sorts of unintended consequences and dependencies that might make you, lead you down the wrong way, for example. And so what you need is, first of all, quite a wide array of measures. So it's not just limited to one or two measures. For example, there are multiple problems that need to be addressed and multiple behaviors that need to be changed by the various stakeholders in the ecosystems, not just the straight government media relationship. And the other one is that through good design and through indirect subsidies, you can avoid the pitfalls that people are worried about. And what I mean by indirect, for example, we're saying every taxpayer in the country gets a tax credit that they can use with an accredited news organization, journalistic organization. And so what you're doing is you're asking the public to make that choice based on how much value they create, what their perception is on trust and on the quality of the work. And there's an element of market dynamics baked into that, because you should see better, more value creating organizations being rewarded for that work. Right. And so you don't have this direct subsidy mechanism. And if people feel there aren't any organizations that are deserving of their tax credits, then they won't do that, right? But what we want to do is we want to remove the financial and psychological hurdle of supporting journalism with the household budget by saying, here's a tax credit. Instead of paying a tax man, you're literally paying a journalism outfit, which is creating a public good, and then obviously qualifies by virtue of the way of the work that it does to meet the definition of public interest journalism, which is public good, for example. And in that way with a couple of others, by reducing VAT down to zero, for example, by making it easier for poor people to access these websites with no bandwidth cost, for example, which is an issue in a lot of countries, maybe not in Europe. You want to remove those barriers, but they're indirect subsidies, and they only kick in once people make a choice to support an organization of certain kind. And so I think with those kinds of mechanisms, and a couple of others where, for example, you're compensated on the assets that are recovered from the work of investigative journalism, and whistleblowers are compensated too. Again, you're incentivizing a certain kind of journalism to happen, and therefore is not a direct subsidy, and you're less likely to be compromised through that. So my short answer to that is that with good design and with studying of other direct subsidy mechanisms, which have led to unintended consequences, and putting a breadth of measures together, you can avoid the majority of those things. And we can work towards improving. I'm not saying it'll solve all of that, but it'll certainly get us to a better place, to give us a chance to reinvest in those things which make newsrooms more sustainable. Rebates for research and development, for example, which the industry is notoriously famous for underinvesting in, right? And we can see when organizations do invest in R&D, they shoot the lights out, where they invest and they know how to execute on R&D. For example, New York Times being probably the best exponent of that, where they now assign 9% of their revenue goes towards research and development. And it's a huge number, massive number. But I can, if you go and ask most news organizations around the world how much they over and above their product and technology spend dedicate to pure R&D, and that number is probably close to zero. So those kinds of rebates, those kinds of incentives that make it easier for leaders to allocate resources to, strategy, leadership development, R&D, those kinds of things, you're going to start seeing an improvement in the quality of these organizations and their ability to build sustainable businesses. And they are absolutely worthy of these public funds because of the value that public interest journalism creates for society. And if you need a case study, well, then we can share plenty of those from down here at the bottom of Africa, where we have actual amounts that have been recovered from our work, and before we even start looking at the savings that the country has benefited from as corrupt leaders have been removed from powerful positions.
Yeah, because impact is a big word that people throw around all the time, but it seems kind of nebulous sometimes. So it's really cool that you guys have some case studies about that. Maybe you could talk about one of those if you have. Sorry to put you on the spot, but if you just had any sort of examples of that, because that's a really, as I said, everybody mentions impact, but what does that mean in practice?
You can have impact at so many different levels. You can have impact at the societal level, where policies are changed because of the work that you do. Presidents of countries or health ministers or the head of revenue services are removed because of corruption. Right? All of those are valid examples, and from work that we've done, it has contributed to all of those things happening, right? Or illegal mining projects being stopped because of the work that is shone a light on the stuff from these illegal activities. And so you can have societal level, you can have organizational impact, and you can have right down to the individual who, decides to change their diet or, to stop treating their ears with cotton buds because it's dangerous, for example, or because they, decide to become an activist support the illegal dumping of sewage in rivers or bays, where they live, for example. And so those are different types of impacts, and all of those examples are, we have done work that has contributed to all those things happening. And sometimes it's hard to measure it, and sometimes it's always after the fact reporting. And I think we need to go to, as an industry, we need to be thinking up front, going, okay, well, we're choosing to invest our resources in the story. Surely we should be thinking like, well, what is the ideal outcome if we write this story, right? What is the impact that we would like to see this thing happen in the world if someone takes this work and then runs with it, right? And does something with it, you know? And to think about that up front, because then you can then start crafting that story in a way that can help make that easier. So for example, if you're doing an investigation, you think this could lead to some kind of prosecution, for example, you also want to package that story in a way that makes it very easy for the National Prosecuting Authority to take this and kind of download these files, download the context, and then take them and go to do a lot more work on top of it and hopefully lead to prosecution. And so having that in mind up front is really important, right? Or if you're going to hopefully have an unjust policy or an illegal mining operation done, then you need to present that work in a way that will help whoever is going to take that and do the next leg in the value chain go out and upgrade it, right? And so this is not about being an activist itself. It's about thinking about like why are we doing this, and then doing the work to support the pursuit of this ideal vision that you had for the story, and then helping it get the most reach that it can out there, right? And so those are different types of impact, as opposed to kind of, we're just writing for biggest reach or to get as many people to read this. It's a little bit more strategic and proactive and conscious about what do we want this thing to do for the audience that we have in mind. Is the National Prosecuting Authority one of the audiences that we have in mind when we're thinking about doing a story? Okay, they are, right? So let's make sure that we cater to that audience as well as the man in the street, or the person in the street who's going to read this and be outraged by this, and where that outrage can then lend support to action, for example. So all of those things are why nebulous. And there's been some really good work done by people, researchers, building out frameworks, how we can bring impact and designing for impact into the beginning of the story, the commissioning parts of the story, the thinking of the story, as opposed to this post-fact reporting thing. Oh, we're applying for a new grant. Let's go and see what impact we achieved in the last year, right? Okay, so that's a very different thing. It's about bringing it right up front to the start of the process.
Yeah, so it feels like you're starting at the end almost, and then working back to the start a little bit for each piece.
It's how the most successful businesses in the world work, right? Is you start with the end in mind, and then you figure out, well, you got to work backwards to how do you get there, right? And what do you need to do in order to achieve this vision? And I think we would all be better off in this industry if we had a much clearer vision at an organizational level, at a team level, and even right down to creating a piece of journalism. Like, you should have some kind of vision or hope or ideal for this piece of journalism. Otherwise, why are you writing it? Right? Just that stenography, paper, record, type ideal is gone, right? That job has been replaced by, social media, for example. How are we going to stand out and create value in this world where, everything has changed? And that's one way that you can do that.
Just that leads me actually to this question. I was going to ask about Amabugani, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Probably not. But is that sort of tied into a little bit that as well?
So Amabugani are a non-profit investigative outfit that started before we did, actually. And they started in another publication. They sort of popularized that standalone non-profit investigative, focused outfit, and did some incredible work. And we collaborated and worked with them over the past. We launched our own internal investigative team, loosely modeled on that, possibly the biggest investigative body of work that has happened in post-democratic South Africa was a collaboration between ourselves and Namakungani and the biggest news publisher in the country, when we got, a cache of emails and documents from a hard drive from this family that was basically controlling the president and a whole bunch of ministries in the country for their own debt. Together, we worked on a series of this body of work called the Gupta Leaks, more than 70 exposés, that led to this corrupt relationship that led to or contributed to a lot of protests, public protests, and people being fed up with the corruption and the lack of accountability, and eventually also contributed to a change in government. And so, or a change in the ruling party's leadership. President's ex-wife was running. The theory was that she was going to run and take over, and he would still be influencing her in the background. But that body of work is an incredible example of collaboration, of the power of public interest journalism being freely accessible instead of being stuck behind a paywall. We would have made a ton of money if we had had a paywall then, but there's also a good chance we might have had a different president of the country. And that kind of weighs on us when we think about, when people say, why don't you just put up a paywall and all your financial problems be gone? Well, that's not the only thing that'd be gone. Potentially the country would be gone too.
Right.
And so those are the kinds of things that we sort of, the stakes are much, much higher here. That body of work led to a whole series of changes, both in the political landscape, as well as for us in terms of building our voluntary membership program on top of that, after that, which then, as that took off, helped us make massive progress on the sustainability front, which we reinvested in growing the newsroom, growing size of the organization, which then helped bring in more people and help create more impact. And so it started to create this like flywheel effect for us. And so there was a massive, everything changed after that body of work.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. So it created a virtuous cycle upwards, basically.
It did. And, through that collaboration and through the impact of that work, we were able to then leverage that and go, okay, look, we've done this. This is the value of that. Help us do more. And at the same time, we're going to keep our journalism free for anyone to be able to access, which is especially important in a country that has such high income inequality, that has such low income per capita, and we have so many unemployed people, right? And so, we often say for the truth to have impact, it also needs that reach. So all of those things kind of went into the designing of the membership program, why it's voluntary, why people could choose the amount of the contribution, and then they know that they're helping to keep the journalism free to others who can't afford to pay, so that we can have this maximum impact, and at the same time build a community around what we're doing, which is much more than just a simple donation of funds, right? We create opportunities for the membership community to engage in our work, to participate in all sorts of different, from our events to, covers for the books that we publish, to ideas for panels, or to, all sorts of different ways of making themselves available if we need them as experts in their own rights. Often some of the most prominent experts in their field are part of our membership plan, and they're in this database that we can just access and go, hey, there's this environmental law agent. I mean, didn't know we had been, so that could be a great source for commentary, or maybe even an investigation, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And sorry to cut across here. I was going to ask, do you have many of your members who contribute like that in that way, who are sort of particularly expert in a given field, and then you can call upon them to contribute?
Starting right in the beginning, on the first day when we launched this membership program, I stood up in front of 1,000 people at our annual conference. I said, look, we can't do this anymore, and we need your help, and we need you guys to join us.
Yeah.
To do this thing. 200 people out of the 1,000 signed up on that day, which is an incredible
conversion rate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then after the sign up came, I was like, oh shit, we now have to build this community and manage this community and deal with everything that goes with it.
Right.
And one of the first people who signed up was someone I knew who had writing and events experience, and I thought would be a good fit to be that community manager. And so interviewed her, and she became community manager. We then took over the membership and then took over multiple parts of this and is now running grant funding and membership and growth and a whole bunch of other revenue projects,
Wow.
which is a great example. Then there was one of the other people who submitted up on the day, a mental health counselor, who started writing opinion pieces for us on mental health issues. But more importantly, when COVID hit, we realized that the additional strain of COVID on already high pressurized environment that our people need to work in, we then engaged with them to be the sort of in-house counselor for our people, because they immediately understood all the things that we're going through, very close to, work that we've done, and is now 4 years later still very busy as the in-house counselor for us. And other examples in COVID, I think 2 or 3 people who were on the government's advisory council for COVID were members. And so we were able to have webinar updates with those people as members and be able to reach out to them, be able to share that insight, what was going on in a time when there was, a lot of misinformation going on and uncertainty. And so that was a great example from an editorial perspective again. And then we've done it, as I mentioned, a lot of leadership and strategic work in the last 3 years. And again, one of our members reached out and said, "Hey, listen, I love what you guys are doing. This is what I do, and I think you and the team could benefit from this." I have went on this coaching journey and leadership journey that helped transform the organization. But so many examples like that of really incredible, of members reaching out or us seeing what they do and go, "Hey, like that's interesting. Could we do something there?" And often they'll either do it as a training exchange or maybe a discounted thing, or sometimes just do it because they feel like they can help in a way that is not just financial, for example. And so we also have a lot of members who have businesses who advertise with us as well, and has come from that recognition through membership first. So there's so many beautiful examples of that membership community, popping up in so many different ways. And it's been amazing to see and to be part of those experiences.
Yeah, it's really cool. It sounds like, because I was going to say, right, that sounds like it could be an expensive endeavor, especially with people of such high caliber who probably outside of the membership would command a relatively high fee. And I remember we spoke before about like the question of whether it's is it a business model question or a market context question? So I guess it's a nice segue into that, is like, how do you, especially if it's not voluntary, right? So I get that some of the members will volunteer, and that's great. If somebody asks, if you deem a contribution to be absolutely necessary, and then maybe you've several of these, and then you're continuously trying to add value for the members, like events or like other kind of community-based things, how do you fund that then? As well, like, so you're funding public journalism, which is difficult in and of itself. And some of that you're releasing for free. But then, you've got member contributions as well. How does the business model work? And then maybe where does the business model limit start, and it becomes more of a market question then?
Yeah, very quickly, we generate the majority of our revenue from members' contributions, north of 40%. Then around about 35 to 40% is from commercial advertising, sponsorships, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then around about 15 to 20% is philanthropy through grants and donations. For example, biggest shareholder in the organization is a nonprofit, and so we're able to access these different types of revenue streams because it's being necessary, right? To do this kind of work, you need the full spectrum. But we recently, because we'd been growing so quickly of the last few years, I think we've been growing about 40, 50% a year for the last 5 years. And we had elections now, and the economy of the country hasn't grown in 10 years. GDP is the same as it was 10 years ago because of the corruption and because of the energy crisis from the corruption as well. So to be able to grow is in that environment has been quite something. But eventually, with the elections, the business, foreign investors, local investors were all kind of pulling back, waiting to see what the outcome of the election was. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt around what was going to happen. And in that pullback, we had to our budgets and our forecasts just didn't materialize because of that. And so we had to go through our own cost cutting exercise following this period of massive growth, and then this pullback of the economy.
Right.
We sent out a note to our readers. We let the market know, and we had people, writing in and calling me and saying, "Hey, listen, we'd love to help. Come and do and this is amazing, right? People in our community, come and do a business model design sprint at this business school, right? And we'll come help you guys." And I was like, "That's incredible. Thank you so much. But no, this is not a business model problem. This is a market context problem." And, what I mean by that is that if we look at the key drivers of sustainability, there are things you can do inside the organization, but whatever you do inside the organization is affected by what the environment around you allows you to do, and whether it's supportive or oppressive. And every country has its own set of factors. And I was actually part of a research project that scored all these environmental factors for I don't know, maybe about 40 countries that had participated in this research project.
Okay.
And no prizes for guessing that the overachieving Scandinavians were right at the top of the most tradable market context environment. I think Norway scored 78 out of 100. And right at the bottom of this market context was the African countries, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, who had participated in the report. And so we had South Africa 10 out of 100 in terms of the market context rating, sustainability favorable that's rating. And so that means is it's 8 times harder to do what we do in South Africa, the exact same job with the exact same resources. You either need to work 8 times harder, or you will get 1/8 of the results of your colleagues doing the exact same work in Norway. And what that says to us is that the market context as it stands now, because it is so uneven, it's like pushing this massive boulder up the hill and you're making no progress, regardless of how good you are at those internal factors. And so even if you're absolutely brilliant at those internal factors, around strategy and monetization and having a differentiated product, the market context now is so restricted that only 1 or 2 winners can survive in that environment. And if you want me to prove my case, just look at the biggest market in the world, right? Biggest market in the world for media, the US. In that entire market, there's one winner, space for one winner at the New York Times. Washington Post, with Jeff Bezos' money and, more than 100 years of being in this business, can't make it work.
Mm-hmm.
The LA Times, which works in a state that would be the 5th biggest economy in the world if it was a standalone country, can't make it work, losing $40 million a year. Right. The Guardian, as a global organization serving the English international market, is losing 20-30 million pounds a year. Can't make it work. So the market, so those people who criticize journalism and say, "Oh, you just need to be better at what you do and you'll be fine." Like, yeah, absolutely, we need to be better, but that's just one small part of it. And even if you are better at what you do, there will only be space for 1 or 2, and society can't afford that when the rivers of shit that flow through social media are so much bigger and so easier to reach into so many different places. So when I look at the problem that we need to solve, it's a market context problem first before we go, "Oh, it's a business model problem," or it's, "You're actually terrible at what you do." Yes, we know we can be better, et cetera, et cetera. But how can we do that when you're in this doom spiral and you're losing people and there's no funding around for investment or development finance, right? For example, like that doesn't exist. So all those things are market context issues, right? And so that's what we need to move towards. That's where we need to focus our resources. Is how do we solve the market context problem?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess then, in your opinion, what could the rest of us learn from all the Scandies? So if it's 78 out of 100 in Norway, how, what are they, let's say, pick one thing that they're doing right that the rest of the world, or at least say the Anglosphere, could learn from?
Yeah, so John, unfortunately, I've got bad news for you because even the Scandis are struggling. So Shipstead, which is considered one of the biggest, most innovative, one of the most innovative news organizations in the world, is now unbundling the news division into, it's because it's a drag on earnings. The marketplace businesses are staying in the news is being unbundled back to the trust. So even they are starting to feel this pain, right? So yeah, and again, that's what I'm saying. It's a market context problem. Because if the most favorable environment in the world is starting to feel these kinds of pressures, then what about the rest of us?
Like you've mentioned the New York Times, right? They're highly successful, but in my opinion, they're not really a journalism organization anymore, right? They're more about games and shopping, and it's a mass market production rather than a journalistic publication anymore. That's my opinion. So
correct, which is a response,
right,
to the market context problem, right? So yeah, absolutely, they've done well to respond to it, and then bring in all these things. And the question is, okay, all things being considered, would you have preferred to have been successful and not have to do all these things, make the same level of revenue without having all these things on the side, right? And in some cases, it's made them a better news and journalism outfit, but in other cases, like, okay, it's great that they've had success in there, but would they have really needed to do it if they were, let's say, getting revenue elsewhere? How many Wordles does the world need? Yeah, that's fine given the current environment, but is that ideal? Do we really want that to be the case? Or would they have preferred to have a different scenario where they're making just as much revenue, but they're doing it of maybe less time that people are spending, but journalism has more impact on the world because now they can allocate more resource and more journalistic craft and product and tech and innovation to journalism, right? And so that's an ideal that I think I would want to strive for.
Yeah. Can you think of any ways of how to, put that into practice, I guess? Again, putting you on the spot a little bit, but because there does seem to be a sort of, I read this recently, I just can't remember where, but there's a trend of that. It's not just the New York Times or that the publication you mentioned in Norway selling off their news divisions. It's happening in a lot of places where maybe they're not actively selling off a division, but the emphasis on objective, impartial journalism seems to go because people are there's more revenue coming from different sources which are more aligned to things like shopping or entertainment or gaming or, classifieds, whatever. So what do we do in practice to, because I really agree with you, right? And this is why Writer's Block even exists, is because we don't do any news or daily updates or anything like that. We focus purely on long form, premium content, essentially well researched, well thought out, and that if there's biases, addresses the biases or tries to come across somewhat impartial as best as a human can be, right? So how does that work from the market context, and then how can that trickle down to the business model level, so that at the very end of the line, readers are getting what they really deserve, right? Especially if they can't afford it, if they can't afford the paywalls for all of these different outlets. But then on the same token, being able to build a durable business, right? That's viable.
What we're describing here is a market failure for public interest journalism, right? And a market failure is defined as something where there's still value being created by that product or service, but the economics no longer work to produce that product or service, right? And so for me, that is what's happening because we can see there's still mass value being created for society. It's just that the compensation mechanisms and the way we fund that currently do not work. And that's a market failure scenario. If we agree that is happening, which I think we can, then you only have two responses to a market failure that you can pursue. The one is philanthropy and the other is policy interventions. Now we know that there's not enough philanthropy in the world for the holes that exist. And we're seeing the decimation of local and city journalism as the front line of where this is happening, right? And the impact of this disruption is being felt there around in the States and in South Africa, and every country in the world is experiencing, the death and the decimation of local and city-based journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if there's not enough philanthropy, then we are only left with one option, which is policy intervention, right? And then it becomes a case of, well, what policy interventions should we pursue? What kind of journalism do we want to incentivize? And what kind of behaviors do we want to change from whom? And those are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Now, we've been asking ourselves that, and we, as a part of the steering committee in South Africa, are going to be making a series of recommendations, to the government saying this is what we need to do. And then that's coming back to those 14, 15 different measures that we feel would change different elements that would make make an environment in which journalism operates more favorable, right? Because our constitution specifically asks us to do a special job for our young democracy. The constitutional courts have elaborated on this special job, but yet there are no special concessions to do this really, really hard job, right? Yeah. And so that's what we're putting forward. And if you think about how journalism was an essential service in COVID, or how UNESCO has written an 80-page document justifying journalism as a public good, or the African Union of Declaration talks about access to information as a right and a critical element of improving the lives of people on this continent. And so everywhere you look, there's multiple justifications to support this notion of supporting journalism as a public good. It's just that some people can't get their heads around where we've come from as a highly commercial, successful organization or industry that was protected by these oligopolistic protections of broadcast licenses or barriers to entry of print. Mm-hmm. Can't get their heads around now this being supported as a public good. It is also why the kind of journalism that we see in the UK, for example, rushes off in a certain direction, which isn't, I would say, necessarily always public interest, right? That the color of the dress that Princess Kate wears to Ascot is not exactly public interest journalism, but it gets eyeballs, and that's the kind of stuff that moves tabloids. And so there's been a big rush to do that. With good design, we can move and shift it into a different area that is, that is defined as public interest, and that creates value in that space. And therefore, if we can tap public funding that doesn't necessarily need to cost the state that much, with good design, you can create a whole new, an improved market context and environment that supports this special job that we're being asked to do.
I didn't know that about South Africa and the constitution, actually. That's really, really cool. And, especially about like helping young people and sort of propelling them upwards through sort of, upward mobility. Do you think then that maybe people have that perception about journalism, and journalism kind of moves in that way because it's become, in the public eye anyway, maybe a bit of a dirty word, like journalism itself? They perceive journalists as tabloidists almost, or that all journalism is bucketed under the one sort of umbrella, and that's kind of like the tabloid stereotype.
Yeah, look, I think especially in the UK, a big chunk of journalistic effort has been allocated to that kind of journalism, and that has contributed to that perception in some way. There's obviously a lot of good work that's also been done outside of that, but that has been part of it. And then the second thing, which has also contributed massively, is that the hijacking of ideas in social media, because the lack of accountability and the lack of guardrails has allowed people to manipulate others into discrediting, the good actors with no accountability for false claims, for example, right? And to create disorder and to create division and to not be accountable for any of that has contributed to that. So it's not just, the tabloid phenomenon on one side. It is also that people have been given carte blanche to go and do all of this stuff, and there's no accountability for it. Right? And so we must not forget that the erosion of trust in the journalism sector has been sped up by the lack of accountability that we have afforded the social media platforms.
Yeah. What's a solution to that accountability? Like, how do we get, because I believe this is actually a problem that goes beyond journalism, right? We see the erosion of institutions broadly in, well, the West, certainly. And also that has then followed through to media. So I guess, and I think it's because of the lack of accountability, right? And then the lack of accountability leads to an erosion of trust. And all of a sudden we're back to our doom cycle. So I guess what would be a good step in the right direction to be able to at least make it easier for people to, I don't know, call out, for example, right? He gets a lot of shit for it, but Elon Musk brought in the community notes thing to Twitter in an effort to make people more accountable. Now you can give out about Elon Musk either way for a number of different things. And, I'm not going to debate about whether he's good or bad for the world, but there is that community notes is an effort. I'm not saying it's correct or not. So I guess in a similar vein, what could incentivize people, because we've talked a lot about incentives today, to be more accountable or to have that impact where the result is people are more accountable?
Those community notes are a step in the right direction. Crowdsourcing fact checks essentially, which is a good option, but certainly obviously not anywhere near enough in terms of what we need. But it is a measure that we could use. The answer lies, the original sin is Section 230.
Can you explain that to people?
Section 230 is an American law that absolved the platforms from liability for stuff that is published on their platforms. And so this was an extension, or I don't know if it was exactly more, but the principle was that if you used the telephone to plan an illegal act, you couldn't hold the telephone company liable for that, right? And so under that premise, they then extended that to the social media platform, which is complete bullshit, right? And that's the original sin that fucked the world up.
Right.
That actually is that lack of accountability, because what we're saying and why it's different, right? If you plan a genocide, or if you produce hate speech, or threaten to kill someone, or threaten to rape someone, right, which are everyday occurrences for people in my team, right?
Yeah.
Section 230, and then you have an algorithm which picks that up and then promotes that to other people who might want to jump on that bandwagon to commit genocide, like they did in Myanmar, right? Or who might want to get behind the murdering or the raping of someone or a journalist, right? Section 230 says you have no accountability. There's no liability, which is absolute complete horseshit, right? Because the minute someone, whether it's an algorithm or a person, takes that piece of content and then promotes it to someone else, you have made a publishing decision, and therefore you should be liable for that decision, right? And so it's very easy. We just need to, we already have the laws of defamation. We had the laws around hate speech and conspiracy to commit murder and rape and genocide, for example, or terrorist activities. And all we need to do is to say, well, the minute one of your algorithms promotes something which is an illegal act, that would be a normally prosecuted illegal act in the real world, you are liable too. And you'll see how quickly we clean this shit up.
Yeah,
it'll happen. Like, they have the tools. They could get like this, right? They already have the tools. We just have to make it enforceable now, right? And that's what we need to do.
Absolutely.
And let's not forget that the lack of accountability that was afforded by Section 230 meant they didn't have to invest that much in cleaning up the crap that is on their platform, which means their profits are larger, which means they can invest those profits into more productive tech and resources that gives them a greater dominance into the space where we now see 97% of all advertising, digital advertising in South Africa and many countries going to just 3 companies.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that has contributed to the collapse of the marketplace and the market failure that now exists. So it's been more than just deterioration and erosion of trust in institutions and in journalism. It has also contributed to the collapse of an industry where, news organizations, we did not absolutely have any God-given rights to advertising. But if you had all the benefits of publishing and none of the costs and responsibilities of publishing, then of course you can end up dominating an industry, or has contributed to the dominating of the industry.
Yeah, I guess you're betting with other people's money in that sense, really, so you don't care. And it comes back to, like you said, right, it's amplification really, isn't it? And that's where you become a publisher. And I remember seeing a stat recently that said, and you'll probably know better than me, right? But like headlines that have a positive twist on them, whatever it might be, they generate anywhere from like 4 to 7 seconds of engagement. Whereas like anger and fear, right, the two, they generate between 3 and 5 minutes per headline. And so that strikes me as like the social media companies know this better than anybody because that's what drives their engagement. And
their revenue, right?
Right. That's because the engagement is it's the attention economy. That's what brings the eyeballs, which brings the ad revenue. So yeah, I mean, they will probably put up a pretty big fight trying to combat a ruling like that in the US, but that seems to be the US, right? And they're all US companies. So how does, say, Europe or Africa or...
It's a US law. It's a US law. There's nothing stopping any other country in the world from implementing their own version for what happens in their country, right? And this is the thing that regulators and legislators are completely overlooked, right? Just enforce the laws that already exist to apply to these publishers and start finding the shit out of them, right? Hold them liable alongside the people who are conspiring to rape and murder people. They are literally confessing to these crimes online. And you set up a special division with a special court to process it quickly, and you start finding the shit out of these people. Then you see about some impact. And you do what happened. We saw a great example in Brazil, right, where Musk took on the Brazilian legal system, and very quickly that provider evaporated when he realized they could just turn access to X off like that. It's time, right? We've let this stuff go too far, and the cost to society has been too great. We can't have elections without it being hijacked, right? Either by internal or external actors. And we can't have the erosion of trust around facts and around institutions go on like this anymore, because the system, as you described, incentivizes these extreme views. And then people realize it's only the extreme views that get the attention. And therefore, you have both sides of the political spectrum heading off into the extreme wings. And then that just creates, what we've seen play out now, especially, the American election, but, the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe. If I go back right to the beginning, what we're saying is the discontent that people feel in the world is not a result of this, and it's been enabled and made worse by the lack of guardrails and accountability on these platforms. There are, lots of other political and economic reasons that, discontent is there, the rising inequality that is happening everywhere in the world, as a main sort of starting point for a lot of this, I think, right? And then that's being hijacked and weaponized by whoever is willing to take and wants to take advantage, because the tools are really now very easy for them to do so.
Yeah. And do you think AI will make it worse? Because that seems to make the cost, that's another tool that makes it even easier, and it brings the cost of publishing even closer to zero. And it's, more or less available to anybody. Even a premium version, you just pay $20 to whoever, Claude or OpenAI or Perplexity, and then you've got, a supercomputer at your disposal. So do you think that'll make it better or worse, or kind of somewhere in between, that some things will get better and some things will get worse?
I think it will. I mean, I don't know how much materially worse it'll get. I think it's pretty bad now. Right, so the question is how much worse can it get, where we can't agree on facts anymore, right? We can't agree on what the color of the sky is anymore, right? Or that people didn't create hurricanes in a lab somewhere, right? And we're in a pretty bad space right now with regards to that, and so. It'll make it easier for people to do that, but it's pretty shit right now.
Yeah, fair. All right, cool. Well, I've got one more question, and then I'll let you go about your day. I've kept you long enough, but I guess what is the one thing that maybe, because we've talked about a lot here, and again, thanks Emil for sharing all of your perspective and insight. What's the one thing maybe people are not talking about that they should be?
Yeah, we touched on the market context stuff, which is very big in my world right now. And every speaking opportunity, engagement I get, I really make a point of trying to sort of carry that message that this is the only chance that we have of revitalizing the public interest journalism sector specifically. And then I think alongside that, as an industry, we're not focusing enough on the strategic foundational parts of being a journalism publication. The stuff that makes the biggest difference towards sustainability is the investment in strategy, leadership development, culture, operations, cost management, data technology, all these things which are sort of foundational and often take a really long time to see a return on investment and difficult to execute on. As an industry, we don't talk enough about that, and we certainly don't have enough skilled people to execute on that, and we don't have enough coaching and training and development opportunities to really improve ourselves in that space. And yet it's the one part of sustainability, integrity, that we have the most that we have control over, but it's the least invested in. And so I think that would be the one thing that I would add to what we've spoken about today, that really is a standout leader that you can pull towards sustainability. But even then, you get that right. Market context is only going to allow for one or two winners in any market. So back to the market context stuff.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And again, listen, thank you for sharing. That's just really cool. Where can people find you and Daily Maverick and all that you're doing and all that you're have you anything to promote or anything you want to share with people?
Look, dailymaverick.co.za is where we publish all that stuff. You'll find us on different social media platforms, and then I occasionally will drop into LinkedIn maybe once every 2 weeks or so. Otherwise, if people need to add me down, maybe hunt out my email address and get open the old school.
All right. Well, subscribe to the Daily Maverick, people. That's the lesson. All right. Well, thanks very much, Styli. Really appreciate your time, and thanks everybody.